Hi, Juliana. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for having me.
I just want to start from right from the beginning. What got you interested in this field of work? And can you just give me a quick brief on what your work is, what your interests are, and then what you do specifically?
Yeah, I mean, they say that research is me search. And so in some ways, I think, humans are fascinating. And I sometimes feel like I'm sort of an alien sitting on the outside looking at people and trying to understand the reasons why they behave the way that they behave. And I kind of, in my own social experiences in my life, I've had challenges kind of understanding why people do what they do. And so I love the idea of having a profession where I can study any aspect of human behavior that confuses me. I'm like, why do people do this? Well, great. I can run some experiments and find out the answer. And so I think, in some ways, that's what attracted me to the field. I thought I was going to be a hard scientist. I thought I was going to be a chemist. And then when I got to college, I started taking the kind of social science classes. I took psychology and economics, and then I totally fell in love with those topics. I thought, on the one hand, sometimes I berate myself because they're harder to do because they're so moderated. There's like so many different factors. And every time you think you get an effect, you're like, oh, but damn, this only works under this condition or it doesn't work in this case. But that's also what makes it so fascinating. So like that's kind of the challenge and the benefit as well of the field. So I did econ and psych in college. I went into economics consulting for a little while because I thought I needed a real job. I didn't have a lot of agency in that job. It was like theoretically interesting, but the day to day was super boring. And I thought, you know what? I'd rather be in a job where I can do anything I want and study anything I want. So that's when I went back to grad school. And then I actually, even once I landed on psychology, I actually thought I had a National Science Foundation research fellowship to study the psychology of pain. I thought I was going to be studying how people come to understand their pain, how they express their pain, how do we measure pain from a psychometric perspective. That's what I did my undergrad thesis on. And then I got into my grad program and I met Nick Epley, who studies mind perception. And I became like totally enamored with this topic and fascinated with it. And so I just completely shifted gears again. And so now I consider myself to be in that field where that's my topic, mind perception. So mind perception refers to how do we make judgments of other people's minds? How do we perceive them? How do we assess their mental capacities? So both like the cognitive capacity and the emotional capacity. What are the consequences of that for social life? And it has to do with like first impressions. Basically every social decision we make rests a lot on the impressions that we have of others. It also is related to kind of like fundamental tendencies to humanize or dehumanize people because perception of mental capacity is a key part of what it means to be human, or the perception of what it means to be human, at least. And then I also am like interested in reading people. So how do we make judgments of mental states? And that plays into things like, how do we choose to negotiate with people? How do we choose to try to help people? Like, what do we see as people's intentions? Are they a friend or foe? And so that leads to kind of outcomes like conflict and cooperation. So I'd say that's kind of like the foundation of all of my research is like mind perception or mind reading. And then I look at all the antecedents, like the things that lead to those things, and then all the consequences as well.
So you mentioned a lot of how, but I want to go back a tiny step as to why. Like why are we first of all like dehumanizing people or like making judgment calls, it like navigating in a different way or like negotiating in a different way. The big question is why do we as humans do that or need to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you think about the ways in which society developed, we live in small groups. Human society is such that we are dependent on each other for our survival, and it's been that way, since the beginning. And when you think about the development, even the acquisition of language, right, and the ways in which humans are able to communicate with each other, that is, arguably superior to most other non-human species. That development has been like our ways to survive and to thrive in our environments throughout history. And that puts us into, but that makes us a very, very social species, right? And so the all the benefits that we've gotten from small group living also come with challenges of like having to get along with each other. And, of course, you can see examples of both like people getting along beautifully with their neighbors and forming these really successful communities, and kind of all the great benefits of social interaction in our lives for our mental health, for our physical health. And I'm happy to talk at length about socializing. But then, of course, you can also think about the ways in which humans have historically come into conflict with each other. And so, it's sort of that very sense of community that also leads us to have this, what's been called the in-group, out-group mindset, the us versus them mindset, right? That, who's a part of my group and who's part of the out-group. And if you're part of the out-group, then you're an enemy. And so you can think about, historical conflicts that have arisen across nations, across divides like race and gender, and what's happening now in the US, like political polarization, what's happening across the world, like what's going on with the Jewish, Israeli, and Palestinians. So I think, the big answer to your question is that, of course, humans have like evolved to depend on each other for their own survival and thriving, but I think it's come with sort of these potential large scale conflicts that we have to navigate. And all of it to me comes back to this like fundamental psychology of trying to read each other and engage with each other. I think when I consider what's like interesting psychologically about the process of mind perception, it's that even though we're like so dependent on each other in so many ways for like our happiness and our well-being and our survival, we also, fundamentally have space between each other where we're not completely transparent to each other. Like we cannot see into each other's minds. And on the one hand, and I've thought about this a lot, on the one hand, you kind of don't want there to be complete transparency. Like, can you imagine if I could just like see everything that you were thinking? Like how awful and awkward that would be. Like not only are there, things that we want to keep secret and that we want to be private, but also like if, just for like kind of the process of civilized and polite society, there's so many things that we think that are just maybe things that we know we couldn't reveal because it would kind of harm the relationship and so on. So I think it's nice in a way that there is this like filter between minds. That's the way that humans are built and all animals are built. But on the other hand, it does create a challenge like when you're trying to coordinate with someone. And so like scholars have actually argued about this, the extent to which people have developed a set of like kind of tools in order to bypass these challenges in terms of the distance between minds. And we sometimes like refer to them as like mind reading tools. And in particular, like what we've argued is that there's bottom up and top down types of tools. The bottom up ones are things like I am in the moment, like as I'm engaging with you, Neha, I'm trying to read you. I'm trying to read your facial expression. You're giving me nonverbal cues. So I'm doing a lot of talking and you're not talking that much right now, which means that all I've got to go on are like your nonverbals, like the visual cues you're giving me. Of course, like if we were going back and forth a little bit more, I'd have some of the semantic content. And so of course, all of that, like language in general, like those are basically bottom up cues that are allowing me to read mind, right? Like what is language if not like the ways in which the manner and the medium by which we can convey our minds to others. That's bottom up. And then top down is that I have learned things about the world, in particular things about people over the course of my life. And that's led me to form a series of like, I'll call them heuristics about people that I bring to bear in any given situation. So before I even have any like cues from you, Neha, I might just know something about you. Like I know that you are, producing this podcast. And so I think, oh, she's really smart. Or, I see the first time I see you, and there's been a lot of research on this, it's called thin slicing. I kind of might have immediate stereotypes that come to mind based on the way that you look. Right. So you're a woman, and that brings to mind a whole set of things. Maybe you're this particular race, that's going to bring to mind a set of things. And then the final like top down influence is that a lot of times when I don't know what to make of you, I might just like project from what's in my mind to your mind. I'm like, well, I don't really, I've got some maybe stereotypes about Neha. I've got some of these kind of cues that you're giving me in the moment, but I don't necessarily know that much. And so I'm going to kind of assume that you think the way that I do. So that's the egocentric projection piece. And so people, as they're engaging with someone else, they're integrating all these things. They're integrating like the bottom up cues, they're integrating like their stereotypes, their heuristics, their beliefs about the situation, they're projecting egocentrically. And all of those things are kind of being seamlessly integrated into this like assessment of you, Neha, as a person, and how I'm then going to interact with you and engage with you, and various consequences that will come from that. And so, I just think that process is really fascinating and really important for all of social life.
Kind of going on a very sticky topic, you kind of mentioned about like, perception based on like, just visual cues, not from top down, where you like you look at a person based on their race, you make a few judgment calls. Would that be almost again historically speaking, and this might like, uh, push the envelope a little bit, where like, race becomes a thing where people just look at you and then like stereotype you,
Yeah.
and then they go like, oh, this blah 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 group of people are like probably lazy, or like, they don't work hard enough, or not intelligent, or like, how they say about Asians that they can't drive, and then that perception kind of perpetuates. Is that something that like, would you want to like expand on that a bit?
Yeah, we can get into the debate on stereotyping. It is a very hot and like long-standing debate in psychology. So, on the one hand, like Lee Jussum has made the argument that heuristics are very useful. I mean, going back to like Gigerenzer, right? Like there is a reason why people have heuristics, and that is because they are essentially mental shortcuts, because humans are not that great about taking a lot of information and processing it rationally. We just don't have most of us do not have the um, mental bandwidth and like kind of horsepower to be able to do just take a lot of information and integrate it in that way. So instead, we have to use kind of all these mental shortcuts. It's just more efficient, it's easier, it's much faster. You can also, in terms of going back to kind of the evolutionary argument, you can imagine that, if there's a potential that someone might be dangerous, or, you want to make that assessment right away, otherwise that could be bad for you. Like it could lead to a bad outcome. So there's a lot of reasons why it might be valuable to make fast judgments, and also that people really just don't have, again, the kind of mental bandwidth to be able to make like slower and more detailed judgments. And so the heuristics exist for a reason. And in fact, again, going back to Lee Jussum, he's really argued that a lot of stereotyping comes from a place of accuracy, right? You learn a piece of information about someone, it's actually true information, and then you start to maybe just kind of rely on that as you overgeneralize. Now, then the problem becomes, and then this is where the big debate is, that to what extent do people overgeneralize in a way that's not appropriate? To what extent might they even learn a fact that is not true in the first place? Like some of these kind of really negative stereotypes, like maybe, I don't know, like, I don't know, Black person is lazy or something. You might like somehow like in the media or there's some depiction that starts this belief in your mind, and then you start to generalize it across all these different situations. And that's not only it's a negative stereotype, it's not really accurate in the first place, and yet you're relying on it. And so that's when I think stereotypes start to become really harmful. And so they've been very implicated in thinking about prejudice, right? And even going back to what we talked about, the in-group and the out-group, right? So someone who is not part of your immediate community, your nation, or your group, however you see your identity, you might tend to just form negative attributions about them much more quickly than you would form about someone who's in your own group. And those negative attributions, because you don't know many people from the out-group, usually people don't know a lot of people that intimately or personally that come from different groups. And so that makes it easier for these like inaccurate perceptions to perpetuate. So I might like learn one piece of information about a group I don't know. If it's an outgroup, it's kind of probably something negative. I never meet an outgroup member, one-on-one and go into enough depth with them to ever break that stereotype. And so the stereotype just persists, and that can lead to all these different negative consequences. And it's been well documented, the various negative consequences of stereotyping. not just in terms of like prejudice and antagonism, but also in terms of like Claude Steele's work on stereotype threat, that, you know, beliefs that people have about a group of individuals, even beliefs that they have about themselves. Like, let's take the gender one, like women aren't good at math. Let's say, or women are not as good at math as men. Like that's one just to kind of pull one out of the air there. You know, it's been found that to the extent that I believe that as a woman, that might affect the way that I actually do math. And so my belief in that stereotype, even if it's not true for me or for others, or it might be nuanced, right? It might be the case that the distributions of math ability look different on average across women and men, and it's moderated by nation and other things. So it might just be nuanced, but I might just have this really simplistic idea of it in my mind that might then, you know, ultimately affect the way that I do math, and in such a way that's been argued that can actually feed into the stereotype. So if I get nervous when I'm doing math, then I might actually perform poorly. And so that now I'm basically fulfilling the stereotype. But not because, you know, that there's something biologically different about my sex, but because of my own like psychology affecting my performance.
What else have you seen? Something like you mentioned, like, women not supposed to be usually better at math than men. And like this is like across the board. What like similarities have you seen where it's like almost perpetuated within our culture? Like, how like it has evolved over time, but then there was a thing where like men don't cry or men don't show emotion, and it has evolved. What have you seen over time, like, in your work that like, we have evolved for the good or the worse?
That's interesting. I don't study that in my own research. I haven't really looked at trends across time. There is a professor at Northwestern University, Tessa Charles Swift, and she has done some really fascinating work looking at trends across time in terms of stereotypes. And as you said, like some of them have been really evolving and changing quite a bit. And she does it in this like really amazing methodology where she looks at like she has a couple of different big data repositories. So for example, she has the repository of books from Google, scanned books. And so she can look at like across all of the books that have ever been scanned across time. And she has, you know, decades and decades worth of books. She can see the use of language and how it's evolved over time. So I couldn't tell you, I don't know her work well enough to tell you about how various trends are changing, but I definitely think you're right in terms of your intuition that many stereotypes have evolved in ways that I think are, you know, interesting. And it's a little bit hard to like figure out the causal direction of like why the stereotype changes, what's changing it. And because again, these things are kind of bidirectional, where it's like, you know, you can imagine that if there are some, you know, for gender has been, the concept and the construct of gender has been changing in the modern age, particularly in certain countries. And so what is it that makes a man masculine or a woman feminine? A lot of those kind of attributes have been challenged kind of in the modern age. And so you know, is it the fact that the media is sort of leading changes in stereotyping, or is it following changes that are coming from individual? You know, it's hard, again, it's hard to figure out the causal direction. I think they're probably kind of multiply determined.
And in what way has social media kind of like catalyzed the whole change of perception versus how would it be otherwise? And like, is it for the good or the bad? How do you see it like changing? What are your thoughts on this whole thing, especially with social media, with access to it, like everyone from across different parts of the world? Like I can look at what's going on in China right now, like literally pick up my phone and I can see a kid like, doing whatever they're doing, dancing on social media, for example, or like, sharing their 2-minute clip on what they're thinking or what they're doing. How does that change the way we see people?
I love that question. I think, you know, I was just writing about this, how social technology is changing our social lives over the last couple of decades, how much change there's been. And there are like 4 changes in particular that we point to. And I'll go through each of the 4 and some of the big consequences, I think, are coming from them. And the research on this is still emerging. So since you brought up social media, I'll mention that one first. I mean, that's been fascinating to think about the advent of it. So, if you think about what social media was supposed to do, it was supposed to explicate our networks in a very like visual and concrete way. So now I have my 5,000 whatever friends on Facebook or my connections on LinkedIn, and I can actually see them and I can access them immediately. And it has done that, right? So like our networks look a little bit different now. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of like Robin Dunbar's social brain hypothesis, but he argued that there are limits to what the human brain can incorporate when it comes to like relationships. And in fact, there were some, I'm not sure if I'm going to get the rules of thumb exactly right, but it's sort of like you can only have at any particular time 5 close friends and like 30 more distant friends and like 40 acquaintances. There's sort of numbers in particular that he was sort of suggesting. The theorizing was that, that the brain can't really account for having more relationships than that on average. Of course, there's some variance around the average. And so when you think about that, there's then this question of, well, let's take Facebook, now Meta. Many people actually have like hundreds and hundreds of friends or thousands of friends listed on that network. And so has that like actually expanded their actual networks in a way? Like, do they actually have more friends now? And so that I think is very arguable. Actually, in fact, when I look at the data, I think, a lot of those people that you are kind of connected to virtually, you maybe are not really friends with. And so maybe it hasn't actually expanded your real friend group, although it has expanded what you might claim to like. So it might expand your access sort of in a way. And to your point, it gives you this kind of interesting and unprecedented window into other people's lives. It's been called the jealousy machine, right? That, the fact that you can see people's lives, but they're curated lives. So they're not like their really authentic selves for the most part, although there's been some like movements toward authenticity. I understand that the word of the year in 2023 was authenticity. So like people are very interested in like trying to be authentic again. But yeah, the concern would be that most of the others' lives that we see in a lot of social media is pretty curated. And so it's only giving us one window, and that can create things like, inappropriate expectations for people's lives and feeling like they're falling short, and that can create depression and other things. But in terms of going back to social media, like the promise of it, so the promise was not just to have better access to people. It was also to, improve social connection, improve people's lives. And most social media websites do have the ability for direct messaging, where you could have a conversation back and forth with people. And in fact, research has suggested that passive use of social media versus more active use can make a difference in terms of the kind of value that people get from their social media. So like Ethan Cross's work has suggested that passive use would be just like scrolling, not really doing a lot of direct messaging back and forth with relationships, but just kind of looking, that maybe building the jealousy machine, versus active use would be like actually doing kind of back and forth messaging and such. And so what he found was that the people that engage more actively in various social media websites end up reporting better well-being with more frequency of use, whereas the people that engage more passively show kind of the opposite relationship. And this gets to a broader theory that like Jeff Hancock and others have advanced called the affordances theory, which is that like in the end, social media is a tool. And so its effects on people's well-being and their broader lives does depend on how they use it. And so there are ways that you can use it adaptively that can improve your lives. And there are also ways in which it might not improve your life if you don't use it very well. And we've actually been trying to understand, we've been playing with a construct we call like technological intelligence, which is like, well, what is that? It's kind of like if you ever heard of like emotional intelligence, the idea would be this is like sort of technological intelligence, like TQ. Like, what is that thing that makes some people like wise and mindful in the ways that they use technology and allows them to fulfill their goals and improve their lives, whereas other people just have challenges with it using technology in wise and intelligent ways. And so we're starting to explore that a little bit, but it's very early stage. And I think more problems. So even though I do agree with the affordances theory, and of course, yes, social media is a tool, On the other hand, like I am also very convinced with a lot of data that's coming out that like on average, it hasn't been that great for our society and for most people. And in particular, social media has been implicated in large scale polarization, misinformation, echo chambers, filter bubbles. So the idea would be that it allows people to reinforce their in groups, right? So I just surround myself by the people that I already like me, right? Even though, which is crazy because it has the potential to expand our network so much. Like you said, Neha, like I could now connect with someone on the other side of the world that I would never have like probably connected with or had the opportunity to do so through social media or through other online platforms. And so I have like this amazing ability to expand my viewpoint and my network and things, but yet we really don't see people doing that for the most part. And in fact, there have been some pretty funny studies like on Twitter, now X, whereby you essentially see like let's take American politics again. Like conservatives are really only following other conservative viewpoints, and they will be pretty quick to like defriend or not connect with anyone who's liberal, and vice versa. And there have been experiments where they paid people to follow accounts that showed the opposite political leanings. And for the most part, like people don't want to do this. Like they'll attrit out of the experiment. Like they don't even want it to be in it. Right. And so people just, you see like kind of widespread evidence of homophily. Like people are really like still just trying to connect with the people that are, and so that are just like them. So that's evidence of, what's been called the filter bubble or the echo chambers. And then in terms of how that might then lead to polarization, it's sort of reinforcement learning that if you're only ever hearing people that agree exactly with your viewpoints, you think, okay, that's true, that's right. And then if you hear, something that is outside of your immediate circle, that's not what you believe, you might tend to believe that it's false. And then misinformation, I mean, this is a broader topic that the concern is that we're facing a crisis of trust across all of our institutions right now. And that we used to have centralized sources that people generally, I mean, there's always been variance, but people would generally say like, this is a trustworthy source, like a mainstream, newspaper, like the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. And I have to laugh a little bit as I'm saying it because those used to be seen as really trustworthy mainstream news sources. Now, of course, they're seen as like highly politicized. Even those, Wall Street Journal is seen as kind of on the right, and New York Times is seen very much as being on the left. And so now that there is no clear source of what is true and what's not, what's trustworthy, what's not, people are turning to other sources for their information. And the worst place to get your like news and your information from is social media, because nothing is being vetted in any way, shape, or form. In fact, I have a postdoctoral scholar right now whose job market paper, which I think is totally fascinating, looks at people's the way they share information on social media and the attributions that the recipients make based on the information that's shared with them. And so the funny finding that he has is essentially that people share information for all sorts of reasons, not just because it's true. So I might share something with you that I know is not true at all, but I think it's funny, it's entertaining, or like I think Neha will get a good laugh out of that. But then what's interesting is that when I share it with you, just the act of me sharing it makes you, Neha, think it's more likely to be true. You take that as a signal that there's some truth value. That Juliana shared this with me, and so she must believe some part of it. Even though I wasn't trying to signal that it was true at all. You take that as a signal. And so you can imagine just like how quickly this, basically that's one way in which misinformation spreads. So it's kind of like
One thing I
rumor
just
at large
wanna,
scale.
sorry to
Mhm.
interrupt you, but something that you did mention where, we build our own echo chambers. I know I can guarantee you that I'm not a unique person in this where I like intentionally follow or like look at content that I don't agree with 100%. Not because I just like, like to like get riled up on social media, because I don't interact with all of the, content that I'm like looking and engaging with in a way, is just to make sure that like I don't, because you can never be 100% like, sure of what you think is right. That never is the case. So like I am almost very left leaning versus right, but then when my thoughts are challenged, like I listen to like a lot of Candace Owens, even though I don't like 100% agree with what she says, or Ben Shapiro, or like there are a few people online who do talk about things which are very, very right leaning. And my objective is not to like turn into them, but see where they're coming from. And that kind of helps me find that middle ground where I go like, you know what, there is a lot more nuance to this argument.
Yeah, that's great that you're doing that. And in fact, there are multiple websites and projects that are out there that are intended to try to help people achieve more balanced media diets. And so, unfortunately, I'm not going to remember the name of several of these websites, but you can find them if you Google them, and they will give you information about the extent to which various different media sites have political leanings, and you can like calibrate your diet. So you could say like, I want a diet that is like 50% liberal and 50% conservative. And you can, some of them are actually really nuanced. Like I've done this before. It's like, and I also want like 10% libertarian, and I want, and it'll curate a set of sources for you that you can read, and you can change your diet over time and things like that. And so there are some really cool tools out there to try to help you achieve sort of more balance. I also like even people that, are fully identified on one side or the other, I would, encourage them to engage with the views of the other side, just to like learn about it, understand it, and, be able to kind of engage with it at a deeper level as opposed to just the straw man. There's a lot of research right now on kind of how do people disagree more constructively with each other. So Julia Minson and Mike Humans and other scholars have research on what they call receptiveness. So what makes people receptive to others' viewpoints? How can people have more receptive conversations with people from opposing sides of the aisle? And they actually even have like a recipe that they've developed. They call it the receptiveness recipe of, here are the kind of like 5 different characteristics of what can make people more receptive. Can we train people to be more receptive? They've identified linguistic cues of receptiveness. So for example, if you and I were having a conversation and we have we might have some different views on things. The extent to which I signal to you that I'm listening, right, and acknowledge your viewpoint, like that would be one aspect of receptiveness, like the level of negativity in my language. Those are levels of receptiveness. Now, in my research, so I think that research is fascinating, and I've worked with them a little bit. In my research, I've thought a little bit more about how like more structural and situational aspects can affect the extent to which people can disagree more constructively. And one of the big ones I find in my research is like the medium by which people interact. So as it turns out that when people have spoken conversations with each other, as compared to written conversations, they tend to be naturally more receptive in their language. And I think there are a lot of different reasons for that. One thing that's also interesting that we find in our experiments is that in-person or video chat conversation doesn't really change much compared to just having even like a phone conversation in terms of overall receptiveness. And when going back to perception of mind, we find that like people perceive conversation partners to be more mindful, like more thoughtful, more likable in general when they're talking with them. Than when they're writing with them. And this is true even when you rule out some like obvious alternative, like some obvious reasons for it. So even if you've met the person before, so it's not just about like writing could be completely anonymous. So that might be one reason, but that's not, it turns out the whole reason why. It's not just because people write more slowly than they speak. So even when we control for time across experiments, you still see that people are more receptive and have higher impressions of their partner when they speak to them. Really, there's sort of 3 different reasons we've ruled in at this point. So one is that speaking has a lot more opportunity for back channeling. Back channeling is basically like check-ins, like clarifying questions, where like you're giving me short reactions to what I'm saying, and that helps me to figure out if we're on the same page or not. Mm-hmm. And so it actually, yeah, exactly like that. You said, that's it. You did it. It's perfect. Now I feel like you're kind of on the same page with me. And now back channels can occur just in visual information, like so you can nod and things. But what we found in our work is that it's largely redundant with auditory. And people, if you're in a phone conversation, people will make up the lack of visual with the auditory cues. So you can still get the back channeling in either of those media. And back channeling is really important for like actually feeling like you understood each other, and then actually true understanding. And true understanding is a precursor to all of these other results, like believing that you have having a more positive impression of your conversation partner and disagreeing more constructively with them. So the back channeling is one. They're just the synchronicity. So that's kind of related to the back channeling, how close in time. So synchronicity in terms of when I speak or write, how quickly you respond back. And so in spoken conversation, you can intervene and we can talk over each other. And there's just like the alignment in time is really, really tight. And in writing, sometimes it's awful. So there are some written platforms where you can see the person typing in real time. And so that does help a little bit. That's actually a little bit more synchronous. But a lot of written platforms are basically like we're sending chunks of text to each other. And if we're actually trying to disagree and kind of talk through that, like what often ends up happening in writing is like I will send you like a 5-sentence little essay about my beliefs, and then you will send me a 5-sentence. And sometimes we're writing at the same time, and so we're like not even responding to each other. We're just like both sending each other essays like in parallel, and we're not really right. Again, we're like not engaging actually substantively with each other. We're like basically arguing separately in our written. So like, I mean, you can see just why writing is so bad with that. And then finally, the third thing that matters is what we call like the paralinguistic cues. So you think about like tone of voice and my rate of speech, and also body language can be paralinguistic as well. So just like all of the things that are beyond the linguistic information itself, beyond the semantic content, which adds color into the linguistics and provides a really important cues to tone and intention. And so, I mean, the kind of clearest example of this that some experiments have been run on is thinking about things like sarcasm or humor. Like if I say something and you can immediately tell if I'm trying to be sarcastic because I use the sarcastic tone of voice. But if I write you the same thing, it's now like really hard to tell. And in fact, so like I mentioned, there's been studies on this, like there's this great paper now it's pretty old. It's like more than a decade old, but I think the findings I'm sure are still robust. And in the paper, what they find is that, communicators think that you will, as the recipient, get my sarcasm. They also looked at humor or my humor, like as clearly as I intended it. Like you will know whether I was trying to be sarcastic or not at a pretty good rate, whether you hear me, like whether we're speaking or whether you're reading what I have to say. And so communicators don't differentiate that much between the media. And then in reality, first of all, recipients, both in the spoken medium and in the written medium, they're not quite as good as the communicator thinks they're going to be. They're not as accurate at assessing the true intentions of the communicator, but the really big gap is in the writing. So in the writing, the communicators think they're basically going to get it. The writers are like at 50-50. Like the readers just don't know much. They're not very accurate at actually being able to assess the other person's intention, at least in those particular contexts. And that's just something that the communicators don't anticipate. So I like that experiment because it really illustrates to me kind of like the whole reason why there's so much miscommunication in writing, and like people don't anticipate that either. But that is kind of actually going back to our conversation regarding what are the big ways in which social technology is changing social life. We talked a little bit about social media. I would say like the overall structure of conversation has been a big thing that's changed. So there's a lot more conversation, even social conversation, that's happening via the written medium. In fact, several like nationally representative polls would suggest that, especially for young people, like more than half of their social interactions are happening over writing now, whether it's texting or whether it's direct messaging. And so just like that move into the medium is very interesting. And I think it's like probably, I would even argue, and I've argued this in several papers, that writing is inherently a dehumanizing medium because it doesn't convey mental intention or mental state very well. It also doesn't express people's mental capacity very well. So you tend to, not only are you less accurate when you're engaging with someone via writing in terms of judging their true intentions, you also tend to think of them overall as being like less thoughtful, less likable across lots of different contexts, especially in disagreement, but even in agreement, we find that to be the case. So yeah, so that's another big change that I think social technology is making. Then like a third change to kind of switch gears a little bit is thinking about the ways in which a lot of the interactions that we have online now are not even with humans. They're with bots.
Hmm.
Right. And so when you think about ChatGPT, but also just the all of like thinking about customer service, a lot of so going back, more than 50 years ago, like Alan Turing very famously theorized, and most people know this theory, they called it like the Turing test,
Hmm.
that the ways that at some point there might be a time in which you engage with an agent and you don't know whether it's a human or not. And Turing at the time, it's called the test because he proposed that that could be a metric by which you could judge intelligence in a machine. So if a machine agent, like a non-human agent, is able to convince a human judge that it's human, you could say that it's passed the Turing test and it's intelligent. Now we don't use that anymore as a metric because pretty much any like good LLM is going to be able to pass that test and convince a human, at least for a while, that they don't really know if they're talking to a human or not. So the test has like kind of been passed. So and so now there are kind of new metrics that have been proposed for sentience in AI systems, which are really fascinating. But I'll say from the psychological perspective, that's kind of philosophical and like
Hmm.
from the psych. So moving back to the psychological perspective, one of the things I think is interesting is that what it means to be human and the cues that we use to assess humanness in online settings have been changing. And in fact, we just wrote a fun paper in which we find that making typos and then correcting typos in written communication turns out to be something that, like, in this moment in time, is actually pretty humanizing.
Hmm.
So when you think about, and this was really more in the customer service context, when you think about like companies that are designing their chatbots and things, like, very, they don't want to have typos. They want their chatbots to be perfect and stuff. But when customers are actually engaging with chatbots, it's like the like weird little things that the bots do that signal to them that it must be human. So like if it makes a typo, but then critically corrects it, I mean, I think what the psychology is that customers think that there must be like a human mind there, right? Because it's like a self-monitoring process. And also, why would you program that into a chatbot?
Hmm.
But that's just like one of many examples of like, what are the ways? Like, I actually had a conversation on Amazon with like a customer service agent a couple days ago, and I did not know whether it was a bot or
Hmm.
not. It was doing this weird thing with punctuation. Like it used a lot of exclamation marks. I was like, that seems weird. I was like,
Hmm.
maybe this is like an overly enthusiastic human.
Yeah.
And it was just like the new cues that I'm using to try to infer that. And then what are also the consequences of that? So in that particular paper, we found that when customers think they're interacting with a human, that makes them feel a little bit better about it being able to solve their problem, especially if the problem is more complex. So it might have these kind of benefits for organizations. Now we do try to be really careful in that paper and in everything we've said about it to make sure we're not telling companies to put errors, typos into their chat systems deliberately in order to try to convince customers that they're interacting with humans so that they get these benefits, right? Like, so there's so many manipulative things that you could kind of do with this information once you have it. And in fact, we find that if a customer figures out that like they thought they were interacting with the human and they're not, that like is a very bad that's a bad experience for them.
So
um
something that I usually do when like, like especially when you get a lot of those spam emails, one thing that I look out for, and I might be completely off on it, is when I see typos, I'm like, okay, this is probably a scam because it's not like by an organization. There's fact checking, making sure things are like, quality controlled. And like, if their logo or their design looks almost copied, or like this is a generic image that's definitely taken from some website and like just plugged in, that's how
yeah.
I assess if that's a scam email or something that like I need to watch out for. When it's just off by a few letters, how would that kind of make sense with like what you just said then?
Yeah, I mean, that's actually why we thought this was such a theoretically interesting. It's like one facet of so many different aspects of written communication. But we thought it was kind of a theoretically interesting one because historically, when an agent makes a mistake, you think less of it, right? Like it's like, oh, it's, a typo, that's something bad. If it's
Hmm.
another person, you're going to think, oh, they're not educated or like they were being sloppy or something. Even if you're, not sure, you might just think it's like a poorly designed bot or something. But then there is, so, that's sort of the obvious kind of what you kind of just articulated, the idea there. But then there's this other literature on what's been called the pratfall effect, which is that sometimes, and you've probably heard the phrase like to err is to be human, right?
Hmm.
That like sometimes errors can actually be kind of humanizing. And the pratfall effect, this is kind of like this fun, really older literature in psychology. It was done more with like high status humans. So
Hmm.
some of like, in fact, I believe a professor was in one of the original experiments. Like if a professor who you tend to think of as being pretty smart for the most part, does something like a little like they trip or something, like kind of
Hmm.
like, oh, that's kind of humanizing. Like, or you can imagine like a celebrity, like someone really high status does something that is a bit of an error, like that could be sort of seen as like, oh, they have human frailties. And that got us thinking, well, it is interesting, like what is unique about humans that AI systems can't easily replicate or wouldn't easily replicate? And so we thought it was sort of this combination of, so how do you reconcile this older literature on the pratfall effect with the fact that, of course, typos are probably generally dehumanizing and
Hmm.
like just indicate bad things about an agent's mental capacities? We thought, well, the way to reconcile that might be to think about corrected typos, because corrected typos are interesting. Where it's like they made the error, so like that seems kind of bad. And you can imagine if there's just like a couple errors in like a chat with an agent, you just be like, that could be like, right, it could just be like a badly designed bot or something. But then if they correct the error, that's like signaling something beyond that. It's like signaling that there's a mind there,
Hmm.
right? So that's where we're like, okay, well, now it's sort of like the corrected typo is now maybe the thing that's humanizing. Now, even though I think it's sort of an interesting kind of quirky finding, uh, it's a moment in time. And so I think the broader idea is like, well, what are the things that we're using in our new and very frequent online interactions to assess the identities of our conversation partners and particularly like the humanness of them? And this is why I said this is like the third big way in which social tech is changing our lives. It's like, yeah, we're basically having a lot of interactions through these like online mediated platforms, and we have to come up with like a new psychology around how to engage with other agents and how to judge other agents. And so I think that's just generally fascinating.
Speaking of online interactions, like something you mentioned, like, especially when it comes to text, there is a lot of things that are missed out on. And then like people are having separate conversations with each other, essays, but like they're not even on the same page. The reason I bring it up is because I work in comms. My day job is in PR. And what I've seen, and like not to disparage my colleagues, but I've seen this across the board, be it with media itself or people who work in the comm side on the other end. They like, imagine I get a call from like an XYZ client, super frustrating. I'm not happy with what they're saying. I'll smile, grin and bear it, cut the phone and be like, what a bitch. Okay, I'll just say, sorry, excuse my French. And then I'll sit down, type an email, which is completely 180 the opposite because I'm being
Mm.
polite. So I feel like what I'm seeing it like distilled is we kind of filter our thoughts. Our true feelings are not completely seen. And like, again, we're professionals. We've got to be nice. Everybody does that at work. You just smile and you do your job. Put your head down, even if you're not happy with your boss or what they said or what like feedback you've gotten or whatever. And then you just do as. But when you're having a conversation, you have these micro expressions, like I said, the nodding or the eye rolling or whatever. That is something that is missed when we're communicating over text or email or like any written form of like, like when we are speaking on Zoom right now, when we are looking at each other, I can see your expression, I see you nodding. But if I were to just say what I'm saying without any agreement, I would stop. I might like, reassess what I'm saying. My response would change. But if I'm texting, that would not have happened. So, like, does that play a role in the way we communicate through different like platforms or like different channels?
Yeah, I love the idea of thinking about it as like filtering mechanisms. So I think my framing has like thought about it regarding paralinguistics. So there's a really famous older theory out there called um, communication richness theory or something like this, where it's like richer, basically like when you have more available cues in a medium, it is considered like a richer medium. But it's a little, the theory is a little bit, it's been argued a lot across communication scholars in terms of like, well, what is like richness, and is it just the addition of cues? And like what we've argued is that there are certain cues that affect various aspects of like conversation more than other cues. So if you're thinking about, for example, the outcome of like judging another person's mental capacities, we find that the voice makes a really big difference in the way in which you judge the other person. Having access to face doesn't make as much of a difference on average, although it can create variance around because of stereotyping and things. But in terms of conversation, it doesn't matter as much. So you could say the vocal cues are more important than the visual cues. And so they're not just purely additive. So you can't just kind of think of it in that simplistic way. But I really liked your framing of like thinking about them as different ways of like filtering or almost creating distance between minds, in the sense that when you're writing back and forth to another person, you have like more distance and more filtering mechanisms where like you could be completely disingenuous to your example, and yet then the other person would just really not know because they just do not have any cues to like suggest the opposite. Whereas at least like in an in-person conversation, you'd have the chance. I mean, the person could still be good at lying and like, mask their facial expressions and their tone of voice and things. But in some ways, the fact that it's harder to mask those features and not as that gives you more of like less of a filter into the person's mind. And so I really like that way of framing it. And that also kind of reminds me about like the lie detection literature. So there's like a little bit of research that would suggest that people are more accurate in detecting lies when they are listening to a person or in a video conversation or a face-to-face conversation as compared to when they read something that they wrote. However, the reason why it's like hard to interpret that literature is there's also just generally more truth bias when you're talking to someone. They tend to think that what the person says is true. So it's kind of like it's hard to disentangle between those different effects. But to the extent that you are able to like more accurately tell what a person is when a person's telling the truth or lying when you speak to them, that kind of is consistent with your suggestion.
Your study on the illusion of transparency sheds light on how individuals overestimate their clarity on their own communication. Can you like discuss practical implications and the phenomenon in everyday life?
Are you referring to the illusion of asymmetric transparency, the Emily Pronin? Yeah, so we just wrote a paper on people's relationships, and so this is going a little bit beyond mind perception, but I think mind perception is at the heart of it, as always, which is like, what are the different aspects that affect people's satisfaction in their relationships? Satisfaction being like, how happy do I feel with my relationship with, let's say, you, Neha? And we looked in particular at two different types of knowledge that can affect this: subjective knowledge. So my belief that I know you in our relationship, and my belief that you know me. Okay, so how much do I sort of feel known versus how much do I feel like I know you, and how those things feed into relationship satisfaction. And both of them are good, like in general. It's better to feel more known by your relationship partners. And this is across all sorts of relationships, not just romantic relationships. And it's better to feel like you know the person. Now, Emily Pronin and other colleagues have this really interesting work. They've called it the illusion of asymmetric transparency, which is that people generally, and we find it in our studies as well, people generally think that they know the other person better than the other person knows them. So they think like, I am less transparent than the other person is. It's harder to know me. And that the psychology of that is really interesting, which is like kind of people think of themselves as being these like complex entities that are hard to get to know, and like there's so much of myself that I'm not even showing to the world. And whereas for like others, once they have like one piece of information, it's like, I know something about you, Neha. I'm like, oh, I know you. I get it. Like, I feel like I understand you. And so people are much more myopic when it comes to judging others, but they think of themselves as being much more complex. And so that kind of helps to account for why you see this difference over and over again. Like people always feel like they know the other person better than the other person knows them. But what we did in our papers, we took it one step further. We said, well, how do those different feelings then affect the extent to which people feel satisfied in their relationships? And we did this across lots of different types of relationships. And what we find, like over and over again, is that it turns out that the feeling of being known is much more predictive statistically for people's relationship satisfaction than the feeling of knowing the other person. So the little bit that I'm known, like if I think you know me better, Neha, I might feel better about our data would suggest I will feel better about our relationship than
Mhm.
if I think I know you better. And we've even done some like fun scenarios where you could think about this in the opposite directions. Like, what if I don't know something about you? What do I infer? And so, of course, if I don't know something about you, if I'm reminded about that, I think, oh, the relationship is not as strong as I thought it was. But we do this comparison between what if you don't know something about me versus me not knowing something about you. So imagine like we're just getting to know each other like in the very early stages and like I forgot your name or
Hmm.
you forgot my name. This awkward thing that happens sometimes in the very early stages of relationship formation. What we find, and just as this one example, what we find is that it's much worse for my assessment of the relationship if you forget me than if I forget you. So if I forget your name, we can recover. Still, like the relationship is, but if you forget my name, the relationship is over, basically. So we find this asymmetry in how much those things matter for people's relationship satisfaction. And then one of the like interesting consequences that we explore in that paper is whether people kind of understand this. And we find some like kind of conflicting evidence here. So we did look at dating profiles. So like you can match.com and coffee meets bagel, for examples. And what we found was that when people are writing these dating profiles, they are often like strongly signaling how much they want to be known by their and
Mhm.
supported by their partner. And we think, by the way, we think the psychology behind this is because largely in people's relationships, they want to be supported more than they want to support. Even though both are important and they do care about supporting the other person, we think that if you were to kind of pit them against each other, people generally want to be supported more than they want to support the other person. And so we find in these dating profiles that people write, they write a lot about how much they want to be known. They're looking for someone who will listen to them and support them and know them. It's like, okay. But then but they don't often signal the opposite, which is like, I will be a really good partner to you. I will really listen to you. I'll get to know you. And that's kind of interesting because, if you're thinking about trying to attract like a broad array of partners, and maybe people aren't, maybe they're trying to narrow. So that might be part of what's going on here. But if you were trying to attract as large of a set of partners as possible, partners find it much more appealing to read about someone who wants to get to know them as
Hmm.
opposed to someone who just wants to be supported and like be known. And so there does seem to be like this little bit of a disconnect where it's like, why are the profile writers not writing about all the ways in which they would support the other person? Like, why are you pitching why you would be a good partner? So people don't really seem to do that.
But what would you recommend to individuals looking to find more meaningful communication, like, with the people around them, and especially in the context of where like misinterpretation can become like have bigger, higher consequences, like you said with dating. But what other things would you recommend, especially to be when they're communicating?
Yeah. So, I mean, to close out the knowledge, relationship knowledge and satisfaction, what that work suggests is that if you want to make someone feel better about the relationship, focus on them, right? And focus on getting to know them and things. And if you are having challenges in your own relationship, maybe that part of that can come from the fact that you don't feel known enough, like the other person actually isn't supporting you enough. So it kind of helps you to figure out what to focus on for relationship satisfaction. In terms of thinking, like I'm kind of on the more micro level in terms of communication and conversation, I guess like one piece of advice I would have for people is that like they can be wiser in thinking about which conversation structures and medium in particular to use at any given moment. And we think about, for the research perspective, if you're trying to make a good first impression, if you care about, how thoughtful the other person is going to find you, like we have a paper on job interviews and people like trying to make a good first impression in the interview. Should you send your, cover letter, your written cover letter, or should you try to make like an elevator pitch, like actually try to talk to the person? We find that essentially the elevator pitch, even if you control the exact words between the two conditions, the elevator pitch is just more, the recruiter is going to find you to be more competent and more thoughtful, and they're going to like you more when they hear that compared to when they read. And one thing that's interesting is that job candidates don't really seem to expect that. They think, if anything, there's a lot of times they want to send in the pitch. And writing can be very appealing because it's a medium that, because it creates the very fact that it creates distance, which we talked about earlier, is a part of what makes it appealing. Because think about it, you can edit it so many times. You can work on a piece of writing and make it perfect. And so that's appealing, right? You could send in this completely perfect. But the thing is, and we find that like communicators are often really focused on that aspect of it. Like they think if I'm going to try to be competent, I gotta, I gotta write and send in a piece of writing. But they're not thinking so much about the recipient and how they're going to be consuming the medium, and how, writing, in some ways it's a lot flatter than speaking, and it doesn't provide as much expression that would convey mental capacity and mental state. And so in that sense, it might not be as powerful of a medium. And you can even imagine that, people could actually take speech and edit it and work on it and come up with you could have a really strong elevator pitch that you've practiced. And that is going to be a lot more impressive potentially than writing. And we also find that people are less forgiving of errors when they read a sentence than when they hear it. All right. And so that's another thing that's working against you. And so I think sometimes the communicators aren't thinking about that. So going back to my prescription, which is kind of based on the research here, I would suggest that people should be wise in terms of which medium they choose to use depending on what their goals are. So improving first impressions, I think you would start with speaking if you're able to. It could be a practice speech, but still. When you're trying to make sure that there's no misunderstandings, you can imagine the first part of a job negotiation. I teach negotiations. The first part of a negotiation, maybe you start with the conversation. So you have, synchronous, you've got all the paralinguistics, you're going to minimize miscommunication. Now, writing, you might want to follow up with writing to make sure things are, set in such a way that, both people can work on a chunk of text together and that they can read everything. So there's like value in writing that you might not have in speaking. So for example, speaking disappears as soon as well, of course we can have a recording, which we do now, but for the most part, like in a lot of extemporaneous speaking situations, the speech, once it's said, it's gone, right? And so maybe you want a record, in which case you switch over to writing. And so I just think that people, like, for example, like people will have this meeting culture where they're like on Zoom all the time. And at some point you're like, you kind of work through all the nuance, like switch over to async, move to email, like get off of the meetings. Or you might be emailing back and forth with someone and you thought it was like pretty simple. You're just kind of working something out and you want to have the written record, but things start to get complicated or there's disagreement. It's like move into speaking, like pick up the phone and like switch the medium so that it makes more sense. I think people just get stuck in the wrong medium and they don't switch as quickly as they could.
I'm going to completely go off tangent for a minute, and I promise you there's a reason why I'm going to bring this up, is cult leaders. And the reason I bring this up is they are able to convince a mass number of people into doing things that you would go like, this is completely bananas. And has there been any study in understanding how they have managed to do that? It's not that they target specifically individuals with like, who are not as intelligent or easily like gullible. I've seen all sorts of people fall into this trap, and then you go, and then when there's these documentaries that come out and they go like, oh, they're just completely swayed. Different walks of life. And there's something about them. There's this charisma, and then they just turn toxic, it gets bad, and then like, snap back to reality. And sometimes that doesn't even happen. So has there been some like part of your work or like, people that who are working on something on how they communicate and what like tools that they are using, which clearly seem to be working not for the best, but yeah.
Yeah, I think the psychology of cult leadership is really interesting. There actually is kind of this whole line of work on it. And I think the psychology is actually pretty complex. So there's things like commitment bias, like once you have committed to something, even when you're seeing signals that was the wrong choice, people like sunk cost bias, like people stay longer than they should stay because they've committed to it, right? So there's that. There's the psychology of like being persuasive and influential. So Robert Cialdini has written like a couple of great books on this, and he has like the 6 principles of persuasion, which is what we teach in the classroom. Also, something that probably cult leaders use. So things like reciprocity, like if I've done something for you, you feel like you have to do something back for me. Um, Things like scarcity, like making it feel like if you don't get in now you're going to lose it, right? So making it feel like a scarce resource. So there's like 6 different principles that I think all of those things could go into why people are can be very persuasive and very influential. I think some of them probably work better in the spoken medium than the written medium, but we don't have like great research on that, so maybe stay tuned for that. But in terms of like the extremism of like cults and why people like stay with like really extreme cults like that, I don't know that literature like as well, but I do know the general psychology of like persuasion, influence, commitment, that kind of thing.
And then your study on the impact of social status and communication suggests that power dynamics play a significant role in how messages are received. Can you elaborate on this dynamic and its implications?
How does power affect the way messages are received? Yeah, so there has been some work on the role of status and power in various aspects of like social engagement and interaction. I'm not as familiar with it, so I don't usually look at that in my own research. So for example, I haven't looked at like how status might intersect different effects of like conversation structure on different outcomes. I will say that, for example, like something that I've done a little bit of research on is like feedback. And what we find is that, when people are lower status, they are more receptive to feedback from people that are higher status, but they also they pay more attention, they take it more seriously. There's also been some work that suggests that like higher status people sometimes um, don't think as much about people that are lower status, like they objectify them or they don't care because they don't have to care as much about their opinions because it's not something that's kind of on their radar as much. But that work has actually been debated a bit because what they found is sometimes higher status people, depends what their goals are. If their goal is like to be a really good manager, for example, then they actually might pay even more attention to their employees. But if their goal is like to do something that's not focused on their employees, then they might very well objectify them because again, it doesn't really matter for their outcomes. So status and power, like it's very complex how they interact with all these things. I'm not really the expert on that line of work, I'd say.
And given the the emerging trend and all the challenges we foresee with how people connect with each other, how do you see communication platforms evolving over time? Like, I know we are in the stage where we are interacting with AI, like you mentioned. We are
Yeah.
also speaking to each other in like very short, quick bursts of information that's spread across the world. Sometimes not even accurately checked. Sometimes you just don't know what it is and if it's even true. I think I remember there was a video on X where there was some apparent bombing of a government office, and then it came out like after 24 hours that, oh, actually, this was just all AI generated. It's fake. But it had spread so quickly that news media picked it up, saying that, okay, this is breaking news. This happened.
Mm.
And like, how does this look like? What's the future?
Yeah, what a fun question. Maybe this is a good question to end on. I don't know for sure, but I will speculate wildly since you've given me the platform to do so. I think, I'm concerned about attention spans getting shorter with a lot of the ways in which our online communication is happening. But, I'm hoping that like, how much shorter can it possibly get? I mean, we have TikTok. We'll see. So that is something that there's been a trend to attention to get span getting shorter. So it's possible that will keep going. However, in terms of like the fact that most interaction is happening via writing, I'm pretty optimistic that a lot of platforms are being developed now that incorporate like a lot of new versions of modalities. So like there's some startups in the Bay Area I've been working with that are creating communication platforms that it's just like modality is almost like an outdated topic because all the media are happening at once. Like it's a video chat, but everything, our words are being transcribed as we're speaking, and the writing can be pulled up on the side, and everything's being saved. And so it's like all of the media are happening at once. And so it doesn't even kind of differentiate between. Now that I think might be too distracting. So I think we're going to have to be really careful about people's attention spans and protecting people's attention spans and how communication can become, very distracting. But I also think that like one of the things that has just been fascinating to watch is how like the written medium has been evolving so much, right? So when you think about where the written medium started, it was like letters, like we were writing on like pen and paper. And then we moved into more synchronous versions of the written medium. So you could like send these, emails back and forth. And then even more synchronous, we were like chatting, we have G chats and text messaging and things. And now we have I mentioned some of these real-time typing platforms. What I would love to see, and we've been experimenting with this a little bit, so who knows, maybe it'll come out, is could we impute paralinguistics into written platforms? So what does it mean to impute paralinguistic? Like as I'm speaking, you're getting all this insight like into my tone of voice and other things. Could we bring that into a text conversation live? So emojis and emoticons do that a little bit. So I can write a sentence and then put a happy face and it changes the tone or a sad face, but it doesn't do it live. And so a better way would be like, so imagine, for example, like as I'm writing, I am controlling the size of my font and the color of my font. So like, and that's happening in conjunction with the writing, and it's all real time. So you can see it as it's being produced. That would be interesting because like if it's like red and gets large, it's like it means something. And then maybe eventually that would signal something. And so that might be just one idea for how to like basically impute paralinguistics into the text. And so I'm excited by like how quickly it seems like our written communication and overall conversation platforms are changing. And I think that's like a really important point in time to be studying the basic psychology behind aspects of conversation to make sure that we get it right as we're designing this. Because you can imagine if there's one conversational platform that becomes really popular, let's say it does something like it changes the color of the text, but that it ends up creating these unintended consequences. Like purple text is seen as really bad. And like what, I know you can just imagine something like happens and we get it wrong, and then it's produced at scale. Everyone's using it. You just want to make sure that it's right,
I
before it
I feel
happens.
like that would just be the consequence of any form of evolution with language, because it's just human nature to do so. We've seen it time and time again being misused and like misinterpreted, and we just kind of work out the kinks as we go forward.
Right. And I'm worried about the incentive structures, like something that might be kind of fun might not be good for civil society or, and so then you end up with having these proliferations of communication technologies or platforms that are like not good. They are really bad for misinformation or something.
Something to chew on for sure.
Yes.
Where can people find your work? Where can they follow you?
I have a website, julianaschroeder.com. I am on LinkedIn and X, so they can find me on there.
And thank you so much for coming online and speaking with me.
Thank you. This was fun.
I'm gonna stop recording.